Imagine being so convinced of your own superiority that you don't hesitate to confront someone you believe you can control. Now, picture the shock when, in that very moment, the power you thought you had slips through your fingers, leaving you exposed, humiliated, and forever changed. This is exactly what happened when a racist officer, high on his own arrogance, approached a black army general, thinking he could belittle him with a few cutting words. But he had no idea that the man standing before him wasn't just another soldier to be dismissed. This was a man with a history, one that could not be overshadowed by the officer's ignorance. What happened next would shatter the officer's entire perception of authority, power, and respect. It would strip him of his arrogance and force him to confront a truth that he never expected to face. His life would be altered forever, but not in the way he thought. In the coming moments, the officer would experience a transformation, a brutal, undeniable reality check that would leave him reeling. And that was just the beginning. The officer walked through the base with the kind of swagger that comes from a dangerous cocktail of privilege and ignorance. His uniform, perfectly pressed, was a badge of authority to him. But behind that uniform was a man who believed his place in the world was unshakable, especially in the army. With every step, he muttered to himself, the echoes of his thoughts dripping with arrogance. Some people think just because they wear a different uniform, they're untouchable. But no one can beat me here. He believed that his role in the army put him above others, that his position and skin color were the keys to his unquestioned dominance. And he was convinced that the system would always protect him. The officer's prejudice ran deep. An ugly belief he'd inherited and cultivated over years, far beyond his time in service. Underneath the bravado, though, there was an insecurity he never let show. It was the kind of insecurity that arises from fearing what one doesn't understand, an irrational fear of others who seemed different, but a fear that deep down he knew was rooted in weakness. But that didn't matter to him, not yet. He had a plan for today, a plan that would show everyone just who was in charge. He was ready to put that plan into action. Across the base, the general walked with the kind of quiet power that only comes from years of service and wisdom. Unlike the officer, he didn't need to puff out his chest or show anyone who he was. His presence alone commanded respect. There was no arrogance in the way he carried himself. The general's strength wasn't loud. It wasn't in the uniforms he wore or the power he held. It was in the calm confidence with which he navigated the world, in the way soldiers moved aside as he approached, not out of fear, but out of recognition of the man's leadership. The officer noticed him from across the yard, and a sharp smile curled at his lips. He knew exactly who this was. This was the Black Army general everyone spoke about, the one whose very presence seemed to stir controversy and whispered conversations in every corner of the base. The officer thought, "Now's my chance." He approached the general, shoulders squared, chest puffed out, his words dripping with venom. "I don't know why people like you are even allowed to wear the same uniform we do. You must know your place, General. You're not cut out for this life." The words fell from his lips, not caring about the men around him who heard, who saw. He wasn't concerned with the consequences. To him, this was just another victory, another moment where he could put someone like the general in his place. The general, calm and composed, stood silently. His gaze was unwavering, but he didn't react immediately. The pause that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. It was as if the air itself held its breath. The officer's eyes flickered, unsure of what would happen next. The silence was deafening. Then, without a single tremor in his voice, the general spoke. "You think you know me? You think you understand my place here?" The officer's smirk faltered, but he didn't back down. "I know exactly what you are. You're just a token, a puppet, someone who barely deserves the rank you hold." The general's eyes, steady and cold, remained on the officer. He reached into his jacket, slowly, as if savouring the moment. Then, with deliberate precision, he pulled out several papers, certificates, documents, commendations. He held them up between them, his voice a quiet thunder. "Let me show you something." The officer's bravado crumbled. As the general displayed his accolades, years of distinguished service, multiple combat honors, his role in shaping the very policies the officer benefited from, the officer's mind raced. How could this be? How did I not know? The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. The general, the man he had tried to belittle, wasn't just some officer. He was a man of unparalleled achievement, someone who had fought for his place, who had earned every step, every promotion. His skin color didn't dictate his worth, his service did. But the officer's realization came too late. His mouth went dry as he stood there, exposed. The smug arrogance that had once filled his veins now felt like lead, pulling him down. His hands trembled, his mind still struggling to process what was happening. As the general turned and walked away, there was no victory for the officer. There was only the crushing weight of humiliation. He had believed himself to be untouchable, above reproach, but now in the face of the general's calm dignity, he was nothing. The officer stood there for a long moment, staring at the ground, the echoes of his earlier words still ringing in his ears. He couldn't undo the damage he had done, and he couldn't take back the insults he had hurled. But what hurt the most was the truth. He was just another man, and his arrogance had cost him far more than he could have imagined. As the general disappeared into the distance, the officer's world shifted. It wasn't just his ego that had been shattered. It was his entire understanding of respect, power, and what it truly meant to be a leader. The general had taught him a lesson he would never forget, not through anger, not through force, but through quiet strength and the unwavering truth of his own worth. And for the officer, that truth was a weight that he would carry with him forever. The officer stood there, his breath caught in his throat. The air around him seemed to thicken, each passing second dragging him deeper into a state of disbelief. The general hadn't shouted, hadn't reacted with the fury the officer had expected. Instead, he had simply pulled out those papers, calmly dismantling the officer's arrogance piece by piece. The officer's mind raced. How could I have not known? His mind flashed back to every interaction, every subtle dismissal of the general's character, every sneer he'd cast when he thought no one was watching. All of it had led to this singular, humbling moment. He couldn't erase the embarrassment he felt now. He opened his mouth to speak, to maybe apologize, to take back the words he had thrown so carelessly, but the words caught in his throat. His hands shook at his sides, the power he had once felt slipping further and further from his grasp. As if sensing his internal struggle, the general didn't turn back to face him. He didn't need to. His silence alone was more powerful than any word he could have said. The officer wanted to protest, to explain, but the more he thought about it, the more the weight of the truth settled in. Then, just as the officer thought he might speak again, just as he felt a surge of foolish pride bubbling up inside him, there was an interruption. A voice rang out from behind him. "Officer, what's going on here?" The officer turned sharply. His heart skipped a beat as he saw two senior-ranking officers approach. They moved quickly, their expressions sharp and focused. They had been observing from a distance, and their arrival couldn't have been timed more perfectly. The officer tried to regain his composure, pushing aside the rush of panic. He straightened, his mind working to reassemble the remnants of his dignity, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself stammering, unsure of what to say. I was just having a discussion with General... The senior officers exchanged a glance, and the officer could see the disapproval in their eyes. They didn't need to say a word. Their presence, the sudden shift in the atmosphere, was all the officer needed to realize just how far out of line he had stepped. "Officer, you're needed in the command center, immediately," one of them said, cutting off whatever the officer was about to say. His tone was stern, firm. The officer felt the last of his power crumble beneath him. His face flushed, but there was no escaping the gravity of the situation. The general, with his quiet poise, had won. The officer had been shown not only his place in the hierarchy, but also the harsh reality of his own ignorance. The senior officer turned to the general and gave him a nod of respect, one that the officer had never imagined he'd see directed at someone like the general. Without a word, the general walked away. His back was straight, his demeanour unshaken. The officer's eyes lingered on him for a long moment, watching him retreat. The general didn't even look back, but the officer couldn't tear his gaze away. It was as if he were watching someone walk away from a battle he had already lost, a battle that had never even needed to be fought. The officer opened his mouth again, wanting to say something, anything, but nothing came out. The senior officers turned their attention back to him, their eyes cold and unwavering. They didn't need to scold him. They didn't need to speak any further. The officer's humiliation had already been made clear. The officer followed them reluctantly, the weight of the situation hanging heavy on his shoulders. Every step felt like a slow march toward a place he had never imagined himself. Each movement seemed to drag on longer, the sound of his footsteps louder in his ears than it ever had been before. As they walked, the senior officers spoke in quiet tones, discussing orders, assignments. The officer was lost in his thoughts, each one spiraling deeper into the realization of just how wrong he had been. The reality of the general's power, his quiet dominance over the officer's ignorant arrogance, had become painfully clear, and the more the officer tried to justify his actions, the more hollow those justifications felt. His previous thoughts of superiority, of dominance, of the misplaced belief that his position could protect him, none of it mattered anymore. All that remained was the undeniable truth that the general had bested him, not with aggression but with grace. His heart sank. I'll never be able to outrun this moment. It will follow me for the rest of my life. And then it hit him, the deep shame of knowing that he had been on the wrong side of history, the wrong side of respect, the wrong side of integrity. He had been blinded by his own biases, his own insecurities, and it had cost him more than just pride. It had cost him his dignity. The officer finally reached the command center with the senior officers, but he could barely focus on what was happening. His mind kept replaying that moment, the general's calm face, his quiet strength, and the officer's failure to see it until it was too late. The tension didn't lift, it settled in him, a weight he would carry with him, always reminding him of the lesson he had learned, too late to change. As the officer entered the room, he took a seat, his body stiff with the heaviness of defeat. And deep down, a small part of him began to understand what the general had known all along. True strength didn't need to be asserted. It simply was. And it was something the officer would have to learn to respect from this day forward. In the silence that followed, the officer couldn't help but wonder, how many more moments like this could he face before he finally understood what it meant to truly lead? As the officer sat in the command center, his mind still reeling from the events of the day, he couldn't help but replay every moment. The confrontation, the stunned silence that followed, and the calm, unwavering presence of the general. Every thought seemed to cut deeper, a constant reminder of how far from grace he had fallen. He wasn't just sitting in a room with his superiors now. He was facing a battle within himself, one that would take much more than time to heal. What had started as a simple act of arrogance had turned into a revelation, one that would stay with him for a long time, perhaps forever. But what about the general? What would his next steps be? How would he move forward in a system that, for all its talk of equality, still carried so much weight of prejudice and division? And as the officer sat there, pondering his next move, we're left with the question, what would you do if you were in his shoes? Would you have the strength to reflect on your mistakes, to face the discomfort of realizing just how wrong you were? Or would the arrogance still linger, an ever-present reminder of how fragile power can truly be? Do you think the officer learned his lesson today, or was this only the beginning of his journey? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss out on more true stories that challenge the status quo, stories that force us all to take a step back and look at the world with a new perspective. Have you ever witnessed something similar, where arrogance met a harsh truth? Share your story below. Let's have a conversation about those humbling moments we all face. What do you think the general should have done differently in this situation? Or do you believe his response was perfect? Would you have handled things any other way? Do you think the officer will ever truly learn from this experience, or will his pride eventually take over again? We want to hear your predictions in the comments.